Uh, our speaker, we're happy to have Dana Kelly come back. She's the executive director of the Norwegian American Genealogical Center and NASEF Library in Madison, Wisconsin. It's one of my favorite places to go. When I'm in Wisconsin, I try to get out there. Nice collection of family stories, picture books, and you name it. Maybe Dana will tell us a little bit more of that. She's presented to us a couple of times. I try not to put too many demands on her. The last time I think was about a year ago. We're always happy to have her present, and she always gives us very interesting material. So Dana, you want to take over?
Absolutely. So thank you so much for having me again. Like Joel said, I am Dana Kelly, and I've been the executive director here at NAGC for about 3 years. And what we do is we have a library and we focus on Norwegian American genealogy and family histories. But there is one part of genealogy that really doesn't apply to only Norwegians. It applies to everybody, and that's using DNA for genealogical purposes. And Norwegian genealogy will always be my first love, but sometimes I think if DNA had come out 20 years earlier as an opportunity for a genealogical research tool, that might have been my first love, because it is definitely my second love. I love to use it. It's opened up a lot of doors for me in my research. And what I was going to talk about today is that pesky ethnicity estimate that you get with your DNA results, because it's almost always what people look at first. They love to talk about the percentage of this and the percentage of that. And absolutely, this tool has completely changed the way we talk about our ethnic backgrounds. We used to say things like, well, I'm half Italian and a quarter Irish and a quarter German. And now we say, I'm 48% Italian, 27% German, and 19% this, and 2% North African. And then we obsess over that 2% North African. We got to know where that tiny little amount came from. So what an ethnicity estimate is a quantification of where in the world your DNA originated within the past few hundred years. Traditionally, this is how we viewed our ethnic backgrounds. We looked at the ethnic composition of our parents, and we presumed that we inherited half of whatever they were. So full brothers and sisters were the same because they had the same ancestors. So this is how my mom would always describe her background. She was 3/4 Norwegian, 1/8 German, and 1/8 Scottish. That's what she was. So these are her results from her DNA test at Ancestry. And now they say she's 84% Norwegian. They give her barely any Scottish and literally no German ancestry whatsoever, according to this estimate. And then a couple of other things that she wouldn't have expected to find, like Baltic or Irish. And this is her results here at 23andMe. And now notice that 23andMe, they don't have Norwegian as a quantified category. They have Scandinavian. And in this case, they give her over 95% of her DNA originating from Scandinavia. They consider Scotland to be part of the UK. And she has almost 4% of her DNA from there. But just like at Ancestry, they detect absolutely no German DNA. Now, here's my heritage. They're giving her quite a bit of Scandinavian DNA, a little over 60, almost 64%. And they do say, especially Norway under Scandinavia. And English at my heritage includes Southern Scotland. So maybe that is catching her Scottish ancestry. But again, absolutely nothing about Germany. And here she is over at Family Tree DNA, and they say she's 63% Scandinavian and 37% England, Wales, Scotland. But again, we have nothing, absolutely nothing from Germany. Well, obviously they can't all be right. They can't all be right because they're all different. And for one thing, every company decides what regions they're going to report, and then they get to define that region themselves. So Ancestry has over 1,500 regions, but you can see that there are parts of the world that they're not including. Is there somebody whose microphone is on? Maybe they could mute. We were getting a little background noise there. So there are some parts of the world that they're not including in their ethnicity estimates. They don't include Argentina. They don't include Madagascar. There's some parts of China that they're not catching. So if your ancestors are from those parts of the world, that means that they're getting called something else. They're getting called something that they're not. You know, maybe Argentinians are being called Peruvian. I don't know. I don't know what they're doing with that, but they're definitely describing them as something that they are not. And then these are all of the different groups that 23andMe identifies with that quantified percentage. So you can see Scandinavia is all one color. And even more notably, the entire Western Hemisphere is all one color. They do identify over 2,000 different groups of people, but they don't quantify a lot of those most of those smaller places. They only quantify these big regions that are colored on the map. So these are the regions that MyHeritage quantifies. And now notice there's absolutely nothing in Siberia. There's nothing in Southern Africa, so nothing in Australia. So if your ancestors are from these places, you're not going to see it in your ethnicity estimate because they are not looking for it. Family Tree DNA, unfortunately, doesn't have a map, but they do have on their website a list of 90 regions that they're grouping our DNA into. Like 23andMe, MyHeritage also has over 2,000 groups that they will plug your DNA into, but they don't quantify most of those. So once they have defined the regions that they're going to lump your DNA into, how do they decide how much of your DNA came from which region? So the first step is to establish a reference population. Every company goes out and they find hundreds or even thousands of people from that particular place. And the group of people is what they have decided is the benchmark for what it means to be French or Japanese or whatever group it is they're trying to define. So you can already see that if they make a bad choice here, this entire system is going to fall apart. You need to have a good reference population to have any sort of accuracy. And then that next step is to compare our DNA to each reference population and look for similarities. Now, there are hundreds of thousands of little segments of DNA that they're analyzing and comparing in this step. They are looking at a lot of information. And each company analyzes your DNA, they compare it to the reference population, and generally they do it multiple times. Ancestry in particular will run your sample through their algorithm 1,000 times. And then after they've run it 1,000 times, they report the average. They calculate the average and they report the average back to you. So if you've ever clicked through and kind of really poked at your ethnicity estimate, you'll see that in a lot of cases, they'll give you a range. And you might have 5% Swedish and Danish. But if you click all the way into it, it might say that that could range as high as 15%, but as low as 0. So they'll give you a range on that because they've done it so many times, and they'll show you what the lowest amount was and what the highest amount was when they ran their calculation. So with all of that science, why do our ethnicity estimates not always match what we expect it to be? Well, there are quite a few explanations for that. And for me, the one that always jumps out is what we're looking at here on this slide. This is a screenshot from a YouTube video. And if you play it from the beginning, it will show you how the borders for the countries in Europe have changed over the past 1,000 years. And I paused it in 1869 because this is when my mom's German ancestors left Germany. And one thing you will notice on this map is that there is no Germany on it. There's a North German Confederation, but that is not covering the same geographic space that what modern day Germany would be taking up. It's a different place. There's no Poland on this map. There are a lot of places, a lot of countries, a lot of ethnic groups that we would conventionally think of as being part of Europe that aren't there. Now, the video ends in 2017. So the place in Europe that my mom's German ancestors left is actually now in modern day Poland. And we're expecting our DNA results to fit within the borders that we can see here. But that is just so incredibly unrealistic. Our DNA doesn't care where these arbitrary lines have been drawn. Our DNA doesn't know what year it is. It can go back a few hundred years and maybe our DNA still thinks it's 1411. It's really hard to put our DNA into categories that fit our 2022 expectations because our ancestors left places that don't fit into the boxes that we see on a map today. They left a different place. So it's pretty unrealistic to expect what you see in that ethnicity estimate to match what the map looks like today. And this is another part of the issue. This is a nice graphical representation of my 3 kids and where they got their DNA. They're in a pretty unique position, actually. Most of us don't get this opportunity. My kids have all taken a DNA test with Ancestry, and so have both of their parents. So have all 4 of their grandparents. And my grandpa, actually, I was able to do a DNA test with my grandparents. They were both still living when this opportunity became available. So I am able to see how much DNA my kids inherited from each of their grandparents and 2 of their great grandparents. And when you're looking at this, you can see that they did not inherit equal amounts from each of their 4 grandparents. They simply didn't. Now, my mom's pie is divided into 2 parts because her parents were the ones who were still living. So the gray and yellow there represent my mom when you add them together. But when you take a look at this, you can take a look at my son and you can see his 2 grandparents there, Lois and Bob. He literally inherited twice as much DNA from his grandpa as he did from his grandma. 17% of his DNA came from his grandma and 33% came from his grandpa. We expect it in our minds to be 25 all around, but it isn't. We don't inherit it equally. And we can see how my middle daughter here inherited 17% of her DNA from her great grandpa. So it's an entire generation off from what my son inherited from his grandma. That's a great grandpa versus a grandma. You would expect to have more DNA from a grandparent than a great grandparent. But we can see here, looking at my kids, the numbers are there. My daughter inherited just as much DNA from a great grandparent as my son inherited from a grandparent. And like if my grandpa was a completely different ethnic group than the other grandparents represented on this pie, my son inherited a lot less of that ethnic background than his sisters did. And we can see how some of these groups can disappear. And it would be entirely possible in a generation or 2 that my son's descendants will have none of his great grandpa's DNA, because it just would be, I hate to use the word bred out, that expression, but it's true. That's what could happen. And now that doesn't mean that my son's descendants are not descended from my grandpa. They absolutely are, even if they never got his DNA. But it is possible you don't inherit DNA from every single one of your ancestors. Some of them have vanished in your genome. Some of them are gone. They're not there anymore. But it is possible that your siblings or your cousins or other distant relatives did inherit DNA from that ancestor, even if you didn't. So I wanted to pull my mom's results from MyHeritage again, because one of the things that I think is really interesting about this one is they are saying that she has DNA from the Inuit, that she is over 1% Inuit. And so now that we know how they're calculating these estimates, what is this telling us? So remember that the first thing MyHeritage did was they went out and they found a group of people who are Inuit. And this decision is generally based on traditional genealogy. These people have a long history of Inuit ancestors based on their family tree. And so what MyHeritage did, they sat down and they found similarities within that group to identify what makes the Inuit Inuit from a genetic standpoint. What is it that they all have in common? And then they compared my mom's DNA to that group of Inuit, and they discovered that a small portion of her DNA matches that group. Now, because my mom and the Inuit share some genetic similarities, even if it's only a tiny little bit, they assigned her to that group. And so let's think about that for just a second here. I have no doubt in my mind that she and this reference population share some genetic similarities. I'm sure they do. But what does MyHeritage really know about that? And what are they really saying? Well, MyHeritage knows that my mom and the Inuit group share some DNA. And because of that, my mom is assigned to that group. However, the DNA that my mom and the Inuit share could have possibly originated with Viking colonists who established settlements in Greenland 1,000 years ago. We cannot be 100% certain that the DNA in my mom's genome originated with the Inuit, because there are a lot of scholars who are fairly certain that the Vikings in Greenland didn't just die and disappear. They were absorbed by the Inuit population, and that their DNA would have been distributed throughout that population as well. So the DNA that is shared between my mom and the Inuit could actually just be Scandinavian DNA. It might not be that my mom is Inuit. It might be that the Inuit are Scandinavian. Now, of course, genetic exchange went both directions. So maybe my mom does have DNA that originated with an Inuit population that was brought back to Norway 1,000 years ago. We don't know. And the inherent flaw with these DNA estimates is that they rely on modern populations to define the genetics of populations that lived 200, 300, 400 years ago. And something else that is really important to remember is that at its heart, ethnicity is a social construction. This is a statement that was formally put out by the American Anthropological Association in 1998. And in short, what they're basically getting at here is that we've been trained to think of groups of people worldwide as being natural. We're separate. We are not similar. This is our differences are rooted in science. And we've been conditioned to think that because we live in different places, we are genetically different. But that isn't the case. It is really hard to draw lines between different populations. It's extremely difficult to do that. We are not biologically distinct groups, even though we have a tendency to think of ourselves that way. And once we got our hands on DNA, it became very, very clear that most of the physical variation in the human population is actually present in every human population. These so-called racial groups have all of the characteristics of all of the other groups. The conventional geographic groups are really the same. They only vary by a tiny bit. So there's a greater variation within the group than there is between the group. And our cultural behavior, our language, the foods we eat, the things we do, we're not born with it. We learn it. We are taught. We're not born with these characteristics. The definition of what it means to be German has changed over time. The boundaries around who is considered white has changed a lot in the last 100 years. The difference between race and ethnicity, those definitions have changed a lot in the past 100 years, and they're probably going to change over the next 100. What we think of as an ethnicity today used to be referred to as a race not that long ago. So I've got a list here of all of these different things that help us define ethnicity, and literally none of these things have anything to do with genetics, but they have a lot to do with the people we share them with. Yeah, there are definitely things that we associate with certain groups. We all know who wears a kilt and plays bagpipes and eats haggis. We know that that's the Scots and the Scottish people. We know we can tell the difference between Irish knitting and Norwegian knitting. We know the difference. There are folk painting styles, wood carving styles that are distinguished or that are distinctive to different groups. The way that holidays are celebrated and life milestones, like a quinceañera or bar mitzvah, we know who celebrates those life milestones. The building styles, like a Swiss chalet, we know what that looks like. There are certain hobbies and pastimes we associate with different groups. You know, as Norwegian Americans, we were all pretty excited as we watched every single winter event in the Olympics be won by Norwegians. We know who the skiers are, but there really isn't a genetic basis for that. That is a cultural thing. They're good at skiing because of how they're raised. None of these things has anything to do with genetics. It's how we have learned to live our lives. And we are taught these things by the people who share our lives with us. And not everyone in the world views ethnicity with numbers. That is a cultural thing in and of itself. There are a lot of parts of the world, a lot of the indigenous populations in the United States actually view the world as these things on the slide and nothing more. They don't believe there's any such thing as half Cherokee. You're either Cherokee or you're not. And they would be baffled by that idea that you could be half. They kind of view ethnicity the way that we view religion. I mean, it sounds strange to me if someone would come up to me and say, well, you know, I'm half Catholic and half Episcopalian. I would say, no, you're one, the other, or neither. You can't be half and half. That sounds ridiculous to me. And the idea of being half of two ethnic groups sounds ridiculous in a lot of places in the world. So what I'm saying is that there's more, there are a lot of ways to view your ethnicity, and there's a lot more to think about than what comes back with that test. Confession. On paper, I'm actually only half Norwegian. If you think about the traditional way of viewing our ethnic backgrounds. And a lot of the times when I say that, there will be some smarty pants who will ask me, well, which half? And I always answer that it's the half with my heart. And that is the honest truth. I identify with being Norwegian. That's who I am, even though I know that I have ancestors from other parts of the world. But that's where my heart is. And even if you identify with an ancestor whose ethnicity doesn't show up in your ethnicity results, you still have every right to claim that ancestor and that ancestry, because it is something that was important in shaping your background. Ethnicity is more than genes, and that is what I want everyone to think about here. They make up very little about what it means to be ethnic. Now, there's something else that Ancestry and MyHeritage offer that give us a little bit more of a granular look into your ethnicity results. And these are definitely worth talking about. Ancestry calls them communities. Now, they don't quantify this, but they have identified some specific places in Norway that my mom likely has roots. She has a genetic connection to these specific places according to their analysis. And based on what I know about her ancestry, I agree 100%. I manage, I don't know, probably 25 tests on Ancestry. I've got a lot of people who've taken DNA tests for me. And I can say that I agree with 100% of these communities. They don't quantify them, so I can't, walk around saying that my mom is 20% Vossing or something like that. But I don't need to, just knowing that they've looked at her DNA and said, yeah, you match the people who come from these places. You must be related to these people. I agree. She is related to these people. I've followed the paper trail, and it led me to all of these places. And these communities are not just limited to Europe and Asia and Africa. They've also identified groups of people in the United States, migrant groups. And the communities I'm showing here actually belong to my great aunt. She has a genetic similarity to other people who have roots in Wisconsin during the mid 1800s. And she's got a connection to this group in Ohio, Indiana, and Eastern Kentucky. And these are a little bit different from the ethnicity estimates. They arrive at these conclusions in a slightly different way. A community is a group of DNA customers. So this is crowdsourced ethnicity estimating, basically. They've taken their customers who have provided family trees, they have millions of them, and they have determined that these people are all descending from a population of common ancestors. And it's exactly what you're picturing. It's a bunch of people who lived in the same area for a long time. And our ancestors weren't as mobile as we are, and they were far less likely to marry outside of their physical community than we are. And they were also less likely to marry outside of their religious community or their language community. So they were able to define these groups that kind of stayed within a group for generations. And this population then is a group of people who either travel to the same place or from the same place at around the same time. So they're tracking migratory patterns. And unlike the ethnicity estimates, assignment to this is based on the user submitted data. Like I said, they've got millions of people in their database. Many of them have family trees with pretty good documented information about birthplaces and immigration dates and death dates in places. So they use that data to determine who was going where and where they went and where they came from. And that's how they assign people to these different communities. So if I go back to my great aunt and just kind of look at this again, they've got her in this early Wisconsin settlers group, and they've got her in this Ohio, Indiana, Kentucky group. Now, just because you have a genetic connection to these groups does not mean that your ancestors were in these groups. It means you're related to the people who are in these groups. Now, I know my aunt had ancestors who were early settlers to Wisconsin, so that makes a lot of sense. Her ancestors were part of that group. But as far as this Ohio, Indiana, Kentucky group, as far as I can tell, and I've done a lot of research on her ancestors, none of them ever lived in that region. They came from Europe and they came straight to Wisconsin. It wasn't one of those, travel through and connect the dots across the United States. They came straight to Wisconsin. But that doesn't mean she doesn't have a genetic connection. What it means is that her more distant relatives may have been settlers of that region. So maybe another group of people who are genetically related to her, genetically similar, settled there instead of Wisconsin. So maybe I would imagine that it's probably her Scottish ancestry that's putting her in this group. There's probably a large group of Scots in that group who are similar to her genetically. And that's why Ancestry is saying, we think you are similar to this bunch. And MyHeritage is doing something similar too. They call them genetic groups. So this is my mom again, and they've identified that she has a connection to Norwegians in the upper Midwest. I can't say that surprises me. Pretty much anyone with Norwegian ancestry is probably connected to that group. And they tell us exactly how they determined it. They took a look at almost 2,000 customers and said, yeah, half of them have family trees. And that's what's helped us decide that that's what we're looking at. We're looking at a group of Norwegians who came to the upper Midwest. So many of you have probably seen in your ancestry results this new feature, the chromosome painter. And so I'm going to talk about this and explain what this really means. The chromosome painter is something that's available at Family Tree DNA and Ancestry. They don't do it at the other two companies. And what it is a visual representation of your 44 autosomal chromosomes. So they're not looking at your sex chromosomes. And it shows where in the world they originated. They're going to paint your ethnicity across these chromosomes. They're going to color code it. So this is my aunt on Family Tree DNA. And we have two pairs of chromosomes here. The top row represents one parent and the bottom row represents the other. The dark blue shows her Western European DNA, and the lighter blue shows her Southern European DNA. And what it's trying to show is exactly which segments are coming from what part of the world. I enlarged this a little bit, 12, 13, and 14, so we could get a better look. Family Tree DNA thinks one copy of chromosome 13 came mostly from Southern Europe, while the other copy comes from Western Europe. And Family Tree DNA doesn't know which parent is which is her mother and which is her father. So that's up to me to try to figure out. Now, my aunt's parents don't have distinctly different backgrounds, so I'm not sure which parent is which. And neither of my grandparents has any known Southern European ancestry. So I have no idea. When I look at this, I don't have Italian or French or Spanish or anything like that in my family. So I really have no idea which parent is which on here. Now, Ancestry's version is, I think, a little bit more useful. Ancestry breaks the chromosomes down with a lot more detail. So I can see Ireland, I can see Norway, they're separate places. It's not just Western Europe. My grandpa has no Norwegian ancestry and my grandma has quite a bit. So it's pretty easy for me to tell that my grandma is the bottom set of chromosomes here when I'm looking at my aunt's ethnicity. All right, so I have this. Well, how am I going to use it? Well, so far, I haven't figured out a way. It's fun to look at, but it's not very practical unless you're managing a whole bunch of tests. It's kind of hard to compare since you can't see other users. You can only see your own. It's kind of hard to tell what what this really means in terms of all of your other DNA matches. We're just kind of seeing chunks of DNA and where Ancestry thinks it came from. And I just wanted to point out how it can't be totally trusted yet. I'm going to compare two parents and their child, and it's actually me and my husband and our daughter. That's what I'm looking at here. This chromosome 2 is what we're comparing, and my daughter obviously inherited one copy of chromosome 2 from me, and she inherited one copy of chromosome 2 from her dad. And we know for sure that she inherited a Norwegian chromosome from one of us, and it could have been either of us. We both have a completely Norwegian chromosome 2, according to Ancestry. So it could have been either one. But her chromosome 2, the other one, is supposedly from Scotland. And neither of her parents has a chromosome 2 from Scotland, according to Ancestry. So clearly there is some room for improvement here. And what I'm getting at is that it's fun to look at, but there isn't a lot of utility to it just yet. I'm hoping that this is just kind of a taste of things to come. Since you can't compare your painted chromosomes to your matches unless you happen to manage their test. So that's why I'm able to look at these three. I'm the manager of all three. If you can't compare the ethnicity on which segment you share, it's not all that useful yet. I just wanted to explain it because it is a fairly new feature and they kind of made a big deal about it, but it's not all that useful just yet. I'm hoping that they're going to be introducing more so that there's a way for us to use this. Now, there are a few traps that people fall into with ethnicity estimates. And the first one is thinking that DNA tests are completely pointless and invalid because they don't think that the ethnicity estimate is right. Don't Please don't do that. Ethnicity is not an exact science, and it likely never will be for all of the reasons that I've gone through today. Unfortunately, it's what people look at first, and then they use it as the basis to decide whether or not anything else within this test has value. They look at this and they say, I should be 100% Italian, and this test says I'm 4% French, and this is nonsense. And the DNA matches, especially the close ones, are trustworthy. You can use this test as a paternity test. It's that accurate. You will know whether or not you are the parent of your children if you all do a DNA test. This test can tell you that. The matching part is good, and that is the secret sauce of using your DNA results. It's not this ethnicity estimate stuff. And the next thing that happens is that people will start to think that there is some sort of non-parental event in their ancestry on the basis of their ethnicity estimate. They'll look at their results and they'll say, I should be 50% German, and the test says I'm only 11% German. You know, maybe my grandpa wasn't really my grandpa. Or they will see that they're 40% Italian and their sister's only 15% Italian. And then they'll say, oh, we don't have the same dad. Otherwise, our ethnicity estimates would be more similar. Resist that impulse. These estimates do not indicate that something is wrong with your genealogical research. If you take a look at your common matches, you can confirm you're matching the people you should and nothing's out of place. If you and your sister share the right amount of DNA, you can determine that you're full siblings. You don't need to worry about this. Don't launch an investigation into somebody's paternity on the basis of an ethnicity estimate. It's just not solid enough for that. And likewise, people will look at these estimates and think they must have made a mistake. I got a phone call not too long ago here at the office from a lady who had researched her family for years, and all of her ancestors had been in Norway for generations. They came to the United States. Before that, they were in Norway. And she got her DNA results back and it said she was 20% Swedish. And she started questioning whether or not she made a mistake. And the first thing I said to her when she told me that, I said, did you happen to test with Ancestry? And she said, yes, I did. And I said, then I have a feeling Ancestry's wrong, not you. I have tested so many people whose ancestry is exclusively Norwegian. I have a knack for attracting those people to me. And almost all of them have a 15 to 25% Swedish result. Almost all of them do. I don't know why. Ancestry is assigning a pretty decent chunk of Swedish to Norwegians. They just must have a hard time telling them apart. So the cousin matching is what will tell you, have you researched the right people? If you're sharing DNA with the people you expect to share DNA with, Ancestry probably made the mistake. It probably wasn't you. And don't get attached to that estimate. It's probably going to change. Mine just changed a few weeks ago. As they collect more data, the estimates are going to change. Mine has changed so many times. I don't worry about it. I've been as little as 46% Norwegian and as much as 75% Norwegian. And that's just at Ancestry. I won't even go into the other companies. A while back, my husband was finally 100% Norwegian. That didn't last long. They took some of it away from him again. And he used to get really excited about being 7% Irish. They took that away from him too. It might be back. You can't take it as gospel. It's probably going to change as they keep, every time they do it, they update everybody's numbers and slide them around. You can't get too hung up on it because it's probably going to be different next year when you go back and look again. And I would encourage you to not put a ton of energy into trying to figure out what those small percentages are. If you have all the time and money in the world, then I guess go ahead. Put as much energy into it as you want. Try to figure out how you got that 1% Inuit, if it means a lot to you. But tiny percentages like that will probably go away. They're probably not valid. And I worked a booth at Roots Tech a couple of years ago, And I cannot tell you the number of people who stopped in to talk to me because they had just taken a DNA test and they discovered that they were 3 or 4% Norwegian, and they had no idea they had Norwegian ancestry. And they wanted to figure out how to find that elusive Norwegian ancestor that they obviously had. I mean, how could you get Norwegian DNA in your results if you don't have a Norwegian ancestor? Well, finding your Norwegian ancestor is like finding any ancestor. You start with yourself and you work backwards. You may find one and you may not. It just might be a glitch in the algorithm and it might get erased with their next algorithm update. And so back to our big question from the beginning, well, is my mom German? And the only way to really know is to do traditional genealogy and then look at her DNA matches. So this is a few of them. I pulled up a few of her matches from Ancestry, and these people are all descended from those ancestors who came from a German-speaking community in what was once Prussia and is now part of Poland. So yeah, she, in my opinion, and the way that I think of it, she has German ancestry. She must have inherited DNA from her German ancestors, or she wouldn't share DNA with these people. Now, I have no idea if Ancestry will ever identify her as having German DNA. I really don't. She's never had it. She's never, ever, ever had a German result. With all the changes over all of the years, no one has ever given her any. And I'm not that worried about it. Ancestry doesn't call her German, so what? I know who her ancestors were. I know that they were German speaking. I know that culturally that's how they felt. I know that's where they came from. And I don't worry about it. I really don't. I know who they were. I've recognized her matches. She has the right ancestors. It's an ancestry problem. It's not a Dana problem. But you can use ethnicity estimates for genealogy. I get really hard on them. I get awfully critical, but I think consumers just expect more out of them than is realistic. I just don't believe that we will ever define ethnicity in a way that can be quantified and make people happy. We're never going to be able to please all of the people with this, but I have used them. When I was trying to figure out who, my dad got a mystery match. One day, a man popped up sharing a lot of DNA with him, and it looked like they were probably second cousins. And I know who all of my dad's second cousins are. And this man was not one of them. So I looked at his ethnicity estimates and I saw he was half Polynesian and half Norwegian. Those two things are pretty different. They're from very different parts of the world. And since he had so much Polynesian DNA, I concluded he probably had ancestors from a Pacific island. And it didn't take me long to figure out that his biological father was probably my grandma's cousin who was stationed at Pearl Harbor when it was bombed. And that he was probably searching for his biological father. And it turned out that was the case. He was his mother was Native Hawaiian, and his dad was someone he did not know. And I was able to tell him that. So that was a key clue for me to figure out who his dad likely was. Now, if you test with several companies and all of them keep telling you that you have Dutch ancestry, there's probably a decent chance that you do. The more times you see it, the more likely it is to be true. Every company could tell that my mom had a significant portion of Norwegian ancestry and some sort of British ancestry. Well, those are probably true. They're all saying it. So there's a decent reason to believe that there's some legitimacy to that. And one person I didn't mention today was my second cousin. Her birth father was adopted and he died several years ago, and she never knew who his biological parents were. And so she did a DNA test. I talked her into it. And when her results came back, Ancestry put her in a genetic community in a town in southern Mexico. And her mother's family is completely Norwegian. So I knew that this had to have come from her dad's side of the family. So when I started looking at all of her DNA matches, I focused on the people who had ancestors from that town in Mexico when I was starting to put things together. And it really helped me narrow down the scope of all of these unknown people. And it turned out that her biological grandfather was born in Texas, but his parents were both from that town in Mexico. So those communities can be really useful because they're so specific. And it really sped up my search process when I was trying to figure out who her biological grandparents were. And I always cringe when I hear people say, well, you know, I'm 13% French, because they got their DNA test results and the test says they're 13% French. Without a paper trail to confirm you actually have ancestors who came from France, you really don't know that you have French ancestry. Ethnicity estimates are just like any other DNA test result. You need to back it up with a paper trail. You need to use that paper. It is so important. A DNA test doesn't replace that traditional DNA or traditional genealogical research. It just doesn't. You can't tell the difference between your father and your son based on DNA alone. You share just as much DNA with both of them. Without knowing more information about them, you can't tell them apart from a genetic standpoint. We still need to use that other information about our family members to figure out who is who. DNA results alone don't tell us much. So what can we take away from our ethnicity estimate? The first and foremost, calculating ethnicity is a huge challenge because defining that ethnicity is almost impossible in the first place. And the way we define it today might not line up with how our ancestors defined it 100 years ago, 150 years ago, 200 years ago. And your ethnicity estimate still needs to be confirmed with that paper trail. My mom may share DNA with the Inuit because the Inuit have Scandinavian DNA, not because she has Inuit ancestry. The communities you are placed in are clues to track down your ancestors, but they're not proof of any particular ancestry, any particular ethnicity. You still need to research whether you share DNA with this group because your ancestors lived in that place, or whether your distant cousins lived in that place and you all have a common ancestor from some other point of origin, you know, like my great aunt in that Ohio, Indiana, Kentucky group. She doesn't have ancestors from there. They all have ancestors from someplace else in common. And it's your matches that really matter. They are the key to knowing whether you've researched the correct ancestors. Your matches are the key to confirming that you don't have some sort of non-parental event. Your matches are where the real value is in your DNA test. That ethnicity estimate is more conversation piece than it is something that you can really use as any type of proof. But in spite of that outsized marketing effort that these estimates are getting and how they have the potential to mislead people because of how little consumers understand them, they do serve one great purpose. They absolutely have generated interest in genealogy and family history, especially to a younger audience. And I think that in and of itself is probably worth its weight in gold. My kids are, you know, tweens and teens, and they love looking at those pie charts. They love being competitive. You know, who has the most Scottish DNA? Who has the most Norwegian DNA? They love it. And so some good has absolutely come of all of this, even though it's probably the least useful part of the test from a genealogy perspective. It's generated so much buzz about genealogy, and it attracts that younger audience than the typical genealogist. And I think that's really awesome. So I got my ethnicity estimate up there for you, so you can see what Ancestry is trying to tell me I am. Right now, they think I'm 62% Norwegian, so that's kind of fun. And then that's a picture of my family when we went to Nordic Fest in Decorah, because they feel a certain connection to their background, partly because of this DNA test. That was something that they were really excited about doing. And younger people are a lot more excited about trying a new technology sometimes than older people are. So it's definitely been a way to bring in that younger genealogy audience, and maybe we can use this to build an interest in more traditional genealogy. So did anyone have any questions for me?
I have to say, this was awesome. I don't have any questions, but thank you, thank you, thank you. You cleared up a lot of my questions. So I want to say thank you. It was a great presentation, and thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you for that. I'm glad it was helpful because I get these questions almost every day. Why is it wrong? Why is it wrong? And 99% of the time, my answer is don't worry about it. Just don't worry about it. That's not the important part. It's fun to talk about, but let's look at your matches. Let's dig into your matches. That's the important part.
It seems that you have done a lot of DNA testing. So how many different tests are there, and should you do it more than once with a particular company?
Well, it depends on what your goals are. It's not cheap to do a lot of DNA testing, I'll tell you that. But yes, I have dragged down and chased so many people to do them because I have found value in it. The biggest 4 companies are the ones that I pointed out. Ancestry by far has the largest database. The last time I looked, I think they had 21 million customers in their database, and 23andMe is kind of a distant second. I think they're at about 16 million right now. MyHeritage has, I want to say 5 million, and Family Tree DNA is something like 1.5 million. They're quite a bit smaller. Now, the big thing that I like about testing in all those different places is that they don't talk to each other, right? If you test at Ancestry and your sister tests at 23andMe, you're not going to see each other in your list of matches because you didn't test with the same company. In order to see a match, they need to test with the same company that you did. And if you don't test in all of the places, you might be missing somebody. And the other thing that there are some different demographics in these different companies. MyHeritage, even though they're not as big, they've got a 25% of the customer base that Ancestry has. They have a much larger European customer base. Most of my matches, I shouldn't say most, but certainly for my grandpa, most of his matches are actually in Norway. They're not in the United States. So I have been able to connect with actual Norwegian nationals because of his test at MyHeritage. The Norwegians are just a lot less likely to test with Ancestry. They test with MyHeritage. So there's a slightly different audience, and you get to match with different people. Now, there are people that I've seen they're like me, they're in every platform. I'll say, oh, look, there's that person again, testing in with this other company. 23andMe has the more health focused audience. They're not nearly as genealogy friendly. And I don't mean that they don't care about genealogy. That's not what I mean by it. The audience just isn't as interested in genealogy. They're more interested, do I, have the gene to be able to taste cilantro, or, do I have the gene for this health condition? They're more interested in that. They have a tendency to be than the users at the other companies. The other 3 companies are a lot more genealogy focused. You can build a family tree on their websites. It's just more of a genealogy audience versus a genetics audience. So, and they all have different tools too. If you like to look at different things, they have different ways of comparing yourself to other people. They're all a little bit different. MyHeritage has some of the best tools. Unfortunately, they also have the smallest database. So there's give and take. Ancestry has some of the weakest tools, I think, but they have such a huge database that there's a lot of value there. So they're all a little bit different.
You can test with Ancestry and then download your raw data and submit it to MyHeritage and Family Tree DNA, especially for Scandinavians. So it's really very, very helpful. And that way you have access to some of the tools. Sometimes you have to pay a little more to have access to more of the tools, but it's one way if you only want to test with one company. I find that I have almost no matches in Ancestry except for US-based people. So it's not nearly as helpful to me as Family Tree DNA or MyHeritage.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the Ancestry does not accept uploads from other companies, but MyHeritage and Family Tree DNA do. So that's a great way to kind of get 3 tests in one. Like you mentioned, you buy the Ancestry test and then you can transfer your results for pretty affordably, even if you do decide to pay to upgrade to get the tools. The last time I did it, it was like 20 bucks. That's
right.
not
I
so
think
bad.
the transfer itself is free and then just 20 for the tools.
Right, just to unlock the tools. And it was like 20 bucks. That's not bad. That's a one-time fee. That's not a subscription. So it's not a bad deal to try it. And yeah, depending on what you're trying to learn, having the MyHeritage might be more useful. It might. For adoptees, I encourage them to be everywhere. If you're trying to find your biological parents and you have no idea who they are, you want to have a line in every pond, because the secret, the magical match may have tested in one place. So you want to make sure that you're there too.
One question is ethical concerns. Is there standards of ethics for people who do genealogy tests and maintain that information?
You mean like if you're testing someone else?
Or, well, they have this whole body of information, and some of this might be damaging to an individual's reputation or be subject to blackmail. Is there any ethical guidelines or ethical standards that corporations are expected to follow?
The companies themselves are they all have their privacy policy on their websites. So you can take a look at how they're using your data. They do not release it to, depending on what the situation is, they do sometimes sell depersonalized data, like in aggregate to for research, like to pharmaceutical companies and things like that. Most of the way that they use your data is just to create more products for themselves, trying to figure out how to get you to spend more money with their company. That's how most of their research is done. But they will not give your DNA results to anyone outside of you, and they will destroy it if you ask them to. Now, I can see who all of my DNA matches are and how much DNA they share with me. And that's up to me to decide whether or not I share that information with other people. Now, you notice when I showed that list of my mom's matches, I blocked out everybody's name because I don't know if they want me telling a whole bunch of people in Washington, D.C. that they share DNA with my mom. So I covered up their names, and I always do that. They also, all of these genealogy companies, when it comes to their website, if you post a family tree on there, they will hide all of the information about living people from the other users. Once somebody dies, of course, that information becomes easily viewable, but while people are living, they won't let other users see that information in a family tree unless the owner of that tree gives permission to a specific user to see that information. So they're pretty good about that. But it is kind of the Wild West out there. On 23andMe and MyHeritage, you can see how closely related your matches are to each other, not just how closely related they are to you. So when I'm looking at, like, you know, my matches on 23andMe, all of a sudden I'll say, oh, here we have a father and son. That's helpful to know. Now I know how those two matches are connected. But if that relationship is a secret, I have no idea if that's a secret to those people. Just because you're father and son doesn't mean you knew that before you took a DNA test. So things like that are kind of the Wild West. When you submit a DNA sample, you are definitely submitting it for your entire family. When I asked him to do a DNA test, I was joking with him. I said, hey, you know, if you've got any kids out there, I might be able to figure that out. And he chuckled and he did a DNA test for me. But the truth is, if he had children out there that he didn't know about, I would have already figured it out using my own DNA test. They would have come up as my first cousin and I would have figured it out. He didn't need to take a test. My test would have given it away already. So you can determine that stuff. So I always tell people, you know, if there's somebody out there that you know is keeping this kind of a secret, I suggest that you recommend to them that they reveal that information on their terms before it comes out in a less sensitive way, a less than ideal way. I worked with a man whose wife discovered she had a half sister because her cousin took a DNA test, and this new cousin appeared in her cousin's results. And the cousin just picked up the phone and called her and said, hey, did you know you have a half sister? Your dad had a kid when he was in the Army. And that was probably not the right way to tell her that information. But that's how she learned. She learned it from her cousin Vicky, who picked up the phone and called her and just told her. And so there is not a lot of, it's really just our own personal ethics that are controlling how this information is being shared. When you take a DNA test, your DNA matches can learn certain things about you, and you are just taking that risk. And what your matches decide to do with that information is actually their prerogative. I saw a raging debate on Facebook one time. This woman wanted to do a DNA test, and her brother said, I do not want you doing that because half of your DNA is also mine, and I don't want my DNA being shared in that database. And then in the comments, it was just this, you know, you need to respect your brother's wishes. No, you don't. It's your DNA. Well, I don't know what the right answer is here, because it is her DNA, but her brother's right. Half of it is also his. And so when you take a DNA test, you do it for your entire family. You can reveal a lot of things that you may not have been expecting to reveal. And I don't know that that information is made very clear to a lot of people when they first start doing this.
Thank you.
You showed us some slides about the chromosome painter. We had a speaker some time ago who showed us how if you have several, and I forget the minimum number, several fairly close relatives, and you have their DNA, you could start to reconstruct prior generations out of it. Have you looked at that?
Yes. Chromosome browsers and chromosome painters are two different things. Chromosome browsers, you can actually compare which segments of DNA you share with your matches. And if you know who your common ancestor is, then you know that that DNA you share must have come from that common ancestor. You wouldn't both have it if you didn't both inherit it from your great-grandparent or whoever your common ancestor is. These ethnicity chromosome painters just tell us the ethnicity, and they don't let us compare to our matches yet. I don't know if that's something they're going to introduce in the future, but they can't be compared user to user quite yet. But the chromosome browser, where you can show those, see the exact segments that you share, yes, a DNA Painter is a wonderful third-party tool. If you have access to that website, I have a subscription. It's not very expensive. I want to say it's like $50 a year. So I have all of the tools, and I have done some of that where I take a look at some of my matches and I say, all right, well, we must have all inherited this DNA from this person. And then I plug that in, and yeah, you can start to put together which ancestors contributed what DNA to your genome. And GEDmatch also has some nice tools if you've ever used that website, where you can really compare some of that granular DNA segment information.
If I share more DNA with a grandson than with his grandmother, his maternal grandmother, does that mean I also share DNA with his father? In order for him to have more than I get from his grandmother?
So
It's
can you
coming
run-
down. Usually it decreases as you come down the generations, but in this particular case, they're all Swedes, and it from the grandmother to the grandson, I have an increase instead of the expected decrease. So I was trying to figure out if that meant I might be related to the grandson's father also.
How much are we talking?
It's quite a bit. I don't have the numbers right in front of me now, but it's significant. It's over 10 or 20 centimorgans.
Okay. Probably. So it's a grandmother and a grandson.
Right. On his maternal grandmother. So it would have
Okay.
to come from his father, right? If he's got more.
It could come from his father, or it could also come from his grandfather. You could be related to the grandmother's husband.
Oh, right. Okay.
Could
And
have come from there.
And that's very likely too.
Yeah.
I mean, Sweden's not a big country. You get a lot of interlocks.
Right. If it's a significant amount of DNA, it probably means you're related in more than one way. If it's a small amount, we're talking like 7, 8, I would say it's probably just a math mistake. There are, they call them no-call regions. And I kind of compare it to, like, let's say you're reading a newspaper and like a water drop lands on the page and it kind of blurs a bunch of the ink, but you can still read the entire article. You know what it says. Yeah, you might have lost a few letters because it got blurry, but you still figured it out. Sometimes that happens when they're analyzing our DNA, where there'll be a spot that they're having trouble reading, but it's not a significant amount. So they don't ask you for a new sample. So sometimes we'll see that type of a difference where you share more DNA with a younger generation than an older generation, but it's just because of a no-call region that they couldn't read it in the older generation, but they could in the younger generation. But if it's a significant amount, it's probably due to being related more than one way.
No, that's very helpful. Thank you.
You bet.
Okay, this has been, I think, a really informative, very, very interesting presentation. Thanks again, Dana.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, thanks for having me again. It's nice that you've got this new technology so you can get speakers from all over the place.
Yeah, we have a few bugs to work out. I'd be interested in hearing from all of you how the experience was any different than usual. For us here, we have the benefit of this nice big screen, so we see all of you very clearly. You're not seeing us very well because it's just through the camera we have here.
You can read all the tiny words on that big screen.
Oh yeah, from the back of the room.
Yeah.
Not only that, but we've got a great amplifier system, so you can hear in the back of the room too.
Very nice.
Thank you. It was really wonderful. And Joel, it worked out just fine.
Yeah,
Thank you.
thanks very much.
Thank you. It was great.
Thank you all. Ask specifically, Tona Hella, were you able to hear the speaker and everything? Okay.
I heard perfectly good.
Good, good. So our system's working great, especially if you're remote. It's we have some problems to work out within the lodge. I have one sort of non-genetic question for Dana. I was going through some of the material we have here, found an old copy of the research guide for Norway.
Oh, okay.
And it looks a lot like the one that I have from you, except this one came from Besserheim.
Oh, yeah, that was probably more than 15 years ago then, huh?
It was, yeah. Our previous president had it, and we got some of his material. But I just thought that was interesting.
Yes, some stuff has changed a lot in the world of genealogy and some has changed very little. So I'm sure there was still a lot of good information in there.
Yeah, except all the new name changes for all of the regions.
Oh, right. Yeah, and probably not much about websites.
Right.
Or what was in there is probably pretty out of date by now.
So I'm going to stop the recording and